Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for what should be a fascinating conversation about a topic that has been a little bit in the news over the last couple of years, election security. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cybersecurity and Technology program here at Aspen, and I'm particularly excited about this panel today, where we have a former NATO ambassador, former Secretary of Homeland Security, and the most powerful person of all, Facebook's global elections head, to talk about sort of the global state of election security around the world and here at home. Before we get started, I want to make the obligatory reminder to please turn off and silence your cell phones. And if you are tweeting about this event, don't forget to use the hashtag AspenIdeas. Nick Thompson, editor of Wired, will be your moderator this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to him.
Great. All right, let's all join the stage. Thank you, Garrett. That was very kind. I could not be more excited. I believe that in the history of panels about elections, this is the first time we've gotten Homeland Security, NATO, and Facebook on the same panel. So if we can't solve the questions...
You missed last week.
You guys were on the same panel last week at Facebook?
Just kidding.
No.
Just kidding.
Whew. So if we can't solve how to coordinate across elections, then nobody can. I have a fantastic panel here. Doug Lute, former United States ambassador to NATO. Katie Harbath, as you just heard, runs election security for Facebook. Jay Johnson was head of Homeland Security. We're going to talk a little bit about...
Was head.
Was.
Though,
yes. Little known fact, you served in the Trump administration.
That's 7 hours and 32 minutes. As a designated survivor.
So...
First one to resign from the Trump administration.
So this is a rare interview I get with a Trump cabinet official.
It's a line.
What I'm hoping we can do here is talk about the attack vectors on elections, all the way our elections can be manipulated, talk about the most important attack vectors, talk about the most important things we need to do, talk about coordination between the different groups, the different tribes, the different families that we have on stage, and then look ahead towards 2020. One ground rule, we have put a moratorium on relitigating what happened in the 2016 election because I don't want to have to ask Secretary Johnson about that again because he's asked about it a lot. And you can ask about it afterwards, but we are going to look into the future and we are going to solve future elections. So let's get going. Attack vectors. There are many, many ways that adversaries, foreign operators, can influence our elections. Secretary Johnson, let's start with you. Please describe your framework for thinking about the different vectors and thinking about the responses.
Thank you for that question. So I tend to look at the threat around our democracy in three distinct threat streams, as they say in the intelligence community. One is the threat to our election infrastructure cybersecurity, which is frankly what concerned me most in 2016, given what we were seeing, the emerging picture we were seeing of the scanning and probing around voter registration databases in various states. Good news there, I'm going to look backward just a little bit.
Sure.
As I left office, I designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. But before that, in the run-up to the election, we actually convinced over 30 states to come and seek DHS's cybersecurity assistance to identify any vulnerability. So that's the good news there. And so far as I know, there were no major intrusions, exfiltrations that altered ballot counts, as far as I know. Two is the exfiltration of emails, data, like we saw with the DNC, and the weaponizing of it for use in a political campaign one way or another. And then three, which is the larger area and probably the most difficult problem to solve and fully understand, is the extent to which various bad actors, foreign influences, seek to influence our democracy and our public opinion through misinformation, the publication, republication of extremist views, and the like. I believe that we have yet to fully understand the extent to which that had an influence on the 2016 election, and I suspect that going forward, it is the biggest threat to our democracy, because as a free and open society, That in and of itself is also our biggest vulnerability.
I did just see that Jimmy Carter, a very rare statement saying, you know what? Russia swung the election to Trump. Just said it flat out today. Katie, so you are on Secretary Johnson's three-part structure. You are totally off the hook on number 1. Facebook does not run our election infrastructure. You're mostly off the hook on number 2, on the exfiltration of information and spread, like DNC stuff spread a little bit on Facebook. But you're totally on the hook for number 3. So tell me about how you think about the most important vectors in the spread of disinformation on social media platforms, and tell me the most important thing that you've done since 2016 to limit the threats.
Yeah, so we've looked at this across many different vectors, because if you think about immediately after the election day in 2016, the story at least about what was happening on Facebook was Macedonian teenagers sharing false news to try to make money. And then then more information came out about Russia and what the IRA, Internet Research Agency, had done on our platform and how they had spread extremist content and polarizing content on the platform. And then we had all the Cambridge Analytica work,
yep.
Or controversy, scandal, whatever topic, word du jour you want to use. So we look at this in 5 main ways when we're thinking about it. First is, what can we do to take down fake accounts? Most bad actors are not using their real identities to spread this information. So the more that we can do to better identify what is a fake account, and when we say fake account, a real person could be behind it. I could be behind that account, but I could be, instead of being who I am, which is a woman who lives in Washington, D.C., I could be pretending to be somebody in London who says that, she's part of the Conservative Party and is trying to influence what is happening there. That is a fake account because I am not accurately representing who I am, and that was a lot of the activity that we ended up seeing from the Internet Research Agency and others. So the work around fake accounts is some of the most important work that we can do. Then there's all the work around false news, where we look at, and Mark talked a little bit about this in his conversation the other day, is there's some content that we'll take down. If you're giving the wrong date of the election, or Republicans vote Tuesday, Democrats vote Wednesday, we're taking that content down. Misinformation is where I think there's been a lot of robust discussion and a lot more that needs to be had. We believe in reducing it and giving people more information and context into that information. There's a lot more work that we need to do in terms of speeding up our detection and our work that we do with fact checkers. We've brought more transparency to political and issue ads. So now if you are in another country, you cannot run those ads targeting the United States. You have to be using US dollars, and you have to be located in the US. There's a lot of work around disrupting bad actors, and I think one of the, we talk a lot about foreign actors, but a lot of work, and frankly a harder question, is domestic actors who might be trying to disrupt an election, pretending they aren't who they say they are, also pushing some of this divisive content. Does it matter, and should our reaction be different if it is a domestic actor versus a foreign actor, which is a really fascinating question. And then finally, there is still work that we're trying to do around civic engagement, reminding people how to register to vote, election day reminders. And we did a lot of work with the secretaries of states for providing that information. So we're looking at, so election security, sometimes you can easily fall just into the, what are you doing to try to stop foreign actors,
yep.
which is super important. But we really think you got to look across it, all those different
Let me ask you a question on fake accounts to deal, a question that I think goes partly in bucket 1 of yours and bucket 4. So if I work for the Russian IRA and I say my name is Bob from Tennessee and Donald Trump is Satan, you knock that down because my name is Igor and I live in St. Petersburg. I'm not Bob from Tennessee. But let's say I say my name is Igor and I live in St. Petersburg and I have a Facebook account and I work for the IRA and I put up something saying Trump is Satan or Joe Biden is Satan. That's fine, right?
You're not going to be able to run ads doing that. But if
I
you
can
organically
post it as organic content?
Yes.
Even if I work for the IRA?
And the tack that
IRA
we've
is
taken
the
there,
Russian troll farm.
and the tack that we've taken there is provide more transparency on pages so that you know where the admins, the countries that the admins are from, that are running that page. So you can see, you could go to that page, and if you're getting that content, you can see that page was created on this date, and it has admins from these countries, including there. But this is, I think, again, an open question as we continue to work through these problems and debate them, and why we can't be doing this on our own. Yep. And why we need to be working with the governments and third-party folks. And academics who are researching these things is debating these questions and having the question of, should you allow it at all? Is transparency the best solution? Is it just giving more context as to who they are? And these are all the things that we continue to grapple with and think about.
All right, well, that leads Ambassador Lute. Should they allow it at all? I mean, should they allow Igor in St. Petersburg to say that Trump or Biden is Satan?
I think if Igor represents himself as Igor, and he's not buying ads, then Igor is Igor. And I actually think there may be some value in the Igors of the world identifying themselves and trying to make their case. Let me just add, though, that I think there's another way to catalog this problem or organize this problem. Jay offered a three-part sort of functional approach, right? I think you can also think about this, especially as we now have a date for the next event, right? So November 2020. You can organize this before the vote, during the vote, and after the vote. And then think about how Jay's functional vulnerabilities apply. So we're in phase one now. We're in the before the vote phase. And here, parties, candidates can be influenced by outside influencers. Opinion can be broadly attempted to be influenced, right? You can influence voter registration before the vote in a very sophisticated way to either suppress the vote in some areas. So for example, if you did a layout of the swing states and you wanted to influence one candidate versus another candidate, you could manipulate the voter registration databases, which are just databases like many other databases hanging on the internet, and manipulate them so that voters registered for one party or another had trouble actually voting on voting day. So for example, change the middle initial of a voter's data in a state voter registration database. Now the driver's license on voting day does not match the voter registration roll, and the individual is denied a ballot. So you can manipulate this process in advance. On the day of voting, you can also, I think, there's at least a vulnerability, and that is that some of our states, about a third of our states, are voting jurisdictions, of which there are over 9,000, by the way, and there are probably one or two here in Aspen itself, right? They all choose the method by which the vote is actually cast, right? About a third of our votes are still cast electronically on push-button machines that are instantly tallied by way of online connections to a larger database. And those online connections, like all online connections, are vulnerable to manipulation. We're actually a little better off and less vulnerable in the day of the vote itself because of this very distributed, decentralized approach in our voting system, right? It's hard. It's going to be hard to manipulate the results of a presidential election if you have to figure out how to attack 9,000 different entities. Although, again, you could target this a little better. And then after the vote, right? The tallying of the vote could be manipulated. Much of that is done online. And then the announcement of the result could be manipulated, and increasingly may be manipulated with fake videos and so forth. So if you think about this, we're already in a vulnerable period in the 16 months leading up to December or November 2020.
So in case the rest of you haven't been diagramming, we now have 45 different categories. Secretary Johnson has laid out infrastructure, exfiltration, and misinformation as 3 big categories. Katie has broken down the third category into 5 different categories of fake accounts, election ads, misinformation, issue ads, and civic engagement. So we have 3 times 5 in each of them. And then Ambassador Lute has very smartly laid it out into 3 different time frames. So 45 different categories. Secretary Johnson, you want to jump in and say which is the most important?
Well, during the 2016 campaign, and here I go again, I'm looking backward, I know. We were very careful. We were walking a very fine line in our public messaging. On the one hand, I and others are trying to highlight the threat that we were seeing to encourage state election officials to come in, but we also didn't want to discourage people from voting. And we also didn't want to be sending the signal that we think that the vote is going to be manipulated, because one of the candidates was saying the exact same thing. And so we kept saying in our talking points, 9,000 different jurisdictions, et cetera, et cetera. The reality, and Doug, you touched on this, the reality of the way our politics works, given the Electoral College, is it only takes the manipulation of a few key precincts in a few key states to perhaps swing a national election. And the writers of the show House of Cards figured that out a couple of seasons ago, and it wouldn't be that hard for somebody, in real life to figure out.
Well, if I could add, the Russians now have a case study, right? I mean, they broadly attempted to penetrate and test the defenses in our election system in 2016. And you can be sure that they learned from this. This was a Russian military operation. So they didn't do this as a one-off deal. They did this as a probing attack. And I think it's safe to assume that when they come back, it'll be in a more targeted, more sophisticated way because they learned about our system.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, not to multiply your 45 by even more.
Please
but
do.
You have all the primaries. February 3rd is when the Iowa caucuses happen. So you have every single one of these phases also leading up throughout the primaries that we have to make sure that we're not taking our eye off of and trying to see if there's things that we can be learning from there that then can be applied to the general election as well.
I want to move into coordination, but before they do that, it sounds like the consensus up here is that the thing we need to be most worried about is manipulating of vote tallies. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think a lot of good work has been done at the state level by state election officials over the last 2.5 years to focus on this. Alex Padilla in California, New Mexico, there was a candidate for Michigan's Secretary of State. She ran on this issue. And so I think a lot of good work is being done at the state level, in paper ballots, redundancy, end-to-end. Pretty soon you're going to be able to track your vote like you track a UPS package, and you know where it's been tallied and so forth. So a lot of good work's been being done there. So I think we're in a better shape than we were in 2016, though I haven't been reading intelligence reports for the last 2 years. I only read David Sanger now. And so my belief is that the real threat lies in the broader attack on speech and political debate.
Okay, excellent. I want to move to coordination, but first, Kate, I need to say that we have something funny in common here, in that one of my dear friends in college rigged my college student government election, manipulated the vote totals to give all the votes to the humor magazine, was caught. I defended him from getting expelled, and then he became a top engineer at your company.
Thanks for telling me that on stage.
At least we know where he is.
I know, yeah.
The guy was so smart. All right.
See, but he's helping us to know what people might do so that we can be smarter.
He doesn't work there
and try
anymore.
to detect it. Oh, well.
There you go.
But let's talk about coordination, because I think it's really important that we talk about the right way for the private sector and the public sector to coordinate. So let's begin with the comments that your friend Mr. Zuckerberg made on Wednesday here, where he talked about the responsibilities of Facebook and the responsibilities of the government. And it was a little bit controversial, but I thought it made a lot of sense. And he said, look, we are responsible for certain things, but if you're going to run an op against the IRA, that's the government's work. So explain to the people who weren't here what exactly he said, explain that argument, and then let's work through it a little bit.
Yeah, so as we've increasingly been trying to work through these issues, there's a limit to what we can do. So for instance, these are some of the areas where we think that there needs to be regulation. On the political ad side, for instance, I can know and I can verify that the advertiser is who he says he is because I have an ID. I can verify that an address is deliverable and that a phone number, there's somebody on the other end that picks it up. But we don't have the capability nor the power of the law in order to require those advertisers to tell us who's actually behind that entity, who's actually funding that entity. I can know that the credit card and the billing address is in the US, but I can't know how that money got to that place that is paying that credit card bill. And so those are the areas, some of the areas where we particularly need to work together with the government and others on this. In addition, we can, if we see bad activity happening on our platform, we can kick them off our platform, but the government is going to have many other levers at their disposal for trying to punish state actors who might be trying to to influence our elections. And then two, on the political speech side, and I think this is what we saw is going to be the most difficult, because given the free speech foundation of our country, the government is likely going to be less inclined to say how speech should be regulated online. And that is one where we're in the middle and the very start of a public debate around how we should be handling some of these things, whether it is deep fakes or misinformation, and how we should be handling that. And so, Mark's view and what we've been trying to do is be a lot more forward-leaning in terms of talking to governments about where we think that we need additional help and where our capabilities end and where we think we need to partner with others.
And do you think you get what you need from the federal government?
It's increasingly getting a lot better. I think one of the difficulties that we continue to work through is what is the right information to share? What is actually needed to act upon these things? How quickly can we move and make sure that all of the different partners have the right infrastructure in place and people to be able to, because this stuff moves fast on the internet. You don't have, and it's going to happen at all hours and on the weekend. They do not take vacations. So thinking through how do we continue to improve on the communication and the sharing of data, and also making sure that we're not having any unintended consequences from moving too fast as well.
Can I rephrase that question with an arrow attached?
Sure.
I have interviewed lots of executives and people at Facebook who have offered a little bit of resentment over the feeling like they didn't get what they should have gotten from the federal government, certainly when involved the IRA operations. They didn't get what they needed in 2016, though I have also heard that it is getting better.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment, that there may have been some issues then, there may be some resentments, but things are working well now?
Yeah, and that's, I was trying not to relitigate 2016 and kind of look, but I think that's 100% right. I think that, we pulled together some working groups in the lead up to the midterms to try to work through some of the issues or things that we all, experienced in 2016 to think about how could we get better for the midterms, and are continuing to do that as we look towards 2020.
Great.
The government rightly should be extremely cautious
Yeah.
about going down the road of policing speech or aiding others in policing speech. You think about what certain government actors would do with the authority to tell Facebook or somebody else, that's fake news, you need to take that down.
I'd be out of a job. If the government could do that, Wired Magazine would be shut down tomorrow, if the current government could do that. So I'm grateful. Thank you, both of you. Ambassador Liu, you want to jump in here? Tell us about the dynamics between the government and Facebook from your perspective.
Well, I don't have firsthand opinions on that, but I thought I'd just offer a slight broadening of this conversation so that we think for a second that this is not just a bilateral issue. This is not just Russia as an attacker, right? We're kind of fixated on that shiny object. But China, Iran, North Korea also have state-led meaningful capabilities in this realm. And America is not the only democracy that's under assault and vulnerable. I mean, we've seen among some of our closest European NATO allies manipulation of the Brexit vote, or at least influence in the Brexit vote, influence in a referendum in Spain. Even more boldly than the sorts of things we've been talking about, Vladimir Putin funds Marine Le Pen's National Front Party in France. So the assault on our democracy does mean this for us locally, this topic, right? But we should appreciate that democracy, even outside the United States, is under assault by a lot of bad actors.
And this is where we've been seeing a lot of wanting to make sure, to your point, everyone is very fixated on Russia, and now everyone thinks Russia is trying to infiltrate their election. But every country really does have unique challenges to their own democracy and different laws. So, not all countries ban foreign donations in their elections. We ran into an interesting case with the EU elections of we decided to not allow cross-border advertising, because some countries within the EU allow foreign funding of candidates. And so it could be very easy for a state actor to fund that candidate, and then they run ads from that country into, let's say, Germany or France. And so, as to your point, we definitely do need to look at this beyond just the United States and how this plays out in across the world.
Secretary Johnson, can I ask you a question about one of the big themes of this week, or one of the big conversations, has been antitrust. It's come up almost every day in some event I've participated in. And one of the arguments against breaking up the big tech companies would be it's much easier for our government to coordinate with one company than with 8. And as we look at the future of elections, it will be much simpler for the Department of Homeland Security in 2020 to just deal with Facebook, which can also coordinate across Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp, than if you were to split it into 4 different parts, or the same thing with Google. Is that a legitimate argument?
It may be easier to work with one company at a time, but I suspect that if we focused on Facebook, the bad actors would simply go elsewhere. And you'd be chasing shadows in a sense. There needs to be, we all hate the phrase public-private partnership, but there needs to be more of a collaborative approach, which I don't believe, and I'm not an antitrust expert, which I don't believe would present antitrust concerns just in the way collaborating on aviation safety doesn't create,
So you're neutral on the
antitrust.
question. You're neutral on the question of whether it's easier for the government to work with 5 large companies as opposed to 50 small companies.
I think it is, I'm sure it is easier to work with one company versus 50 smaller companies. I don't know that it would be I don't know how effective that would be if you focus on one big actor.
Okay, let me ask another large
Right?
question.
Am I wrong or right?
No, I think you're right. I mean, we also, the more that Facebook, the Blue app, does, we're also increasingly looking at, okay, is that moving to Instagram? And there's some countries where Instagram has a higher user base than Facebook even does.
Yep.
And then to your point, are you even pushing that down? As part of the work that we do as well, Microsoft's a part of it, Twitter's a part of it, Google is a part of it too. And I think we need to continue to be thinking about how can we help the smaller companies who may not have as many resources to put into this as well, regardless of whether they're owned by us or not.
Let's not forget, and I know Doug will agree with this, let's not forget that when you're talking about defense, the most effective defense when you're dealing with nation-state actors is to make the bad behavior cost prohibitive and to provide sufficient deterrence.
Yep. Because
nation-states, at least the rational ones, all have certain things in common. They will respond to things that are cost prohibitive. They will, if you make the behavior cost prohibitive, they will cease the activity, whether you're a communist regime, a dictatorship, or a democracy. And Russia, unfortunately, is still a work in progress. We saw that live and on stage yesterday.
So how do we make it cost prohibitive?
So 2 quick factors here, right? I mean, I think Jay's onto something that, in classic sense, deterrence theory, right, depends upon placing at risk something your potential opponent values.
Yep.
Right? So in the nuclear realm, that's pretty clear. You don't want to be attacked and so forth, right? And deterrence in the conventional realm of armament and the nuclear realm of armament is very well developed. It's 50, 60-year-old set of theories and so forth. And frankly, it's got quite a body of success, right? The challenge in this arena is that if it is difficult to detect who the attacker is,
Yep.
then you don't know how to put in place this calculus that would place that attacker at risk, you see?
Right.
So the attacker in 2016, I'm sure the IRA, the Russian government, assumed that they would be anonymous, assumed that they would not be detected, right? Or at a minimum that the attack would be very ambiguous and they would not be able to attribute the attack on our election system to the Russian government, as we've now done. But as it turned out, the Russians were Russian, okay? And they were a little heavy-handed, and they were a little sloppy, and they left digital fingerprints on their attack, which resulted in DHS and our intelligence community being able to attribute an attack which was designed to be anonymous. So the first thing here in terms of bolstering deterrence is to increase our capacity to attribute, right? Because then we can begin to set in place this cost-benefit calculus with potential opponents. And if we just think about Russia, there are information vulnerabilities in Putin's regime between Putin, his intelligence services, and the Russian oligarchs who keep Putin in power. There are information vulnerabilities that he would rather not have disclosed, that we know. So I think there's a potential here to fight fire with fire and establish a bit of a deterrence relationship. Not saying that we're going to, shut down the air traffic control system in Russia or maybe the electrical grid, which has been in the news lately. But let's put at risk something that Vladimir Putin really values, like his finances.
So you think that right now the US government should do something like disclose Vladimir Putin's finances, both to send a signal to him, not to attack 2020, but also to send a signal to any other country that might want to attack us?
I would hold it in abeyance. I would not disclose it, but I would let him know that if you interfere in 2020, then that.
You would let him know.
And the consequences.
Neither one of us is in a position to know everything the U.S. government has done since we left
That's
government
fair.
in 2017. All I will say in answer to that is you have to create sufficient deterrence.
But we've also seen, Jay, over the last 24 hours, in the G20 meeting in Japan, our president sort of was jokingly commenting about Russian interference. Right. And it was a matter of humor between him and President Putin. That didn't suggest to me that some sort of deterrence equation is in place.
And an interesting thing just on deterrence, especially as we think about misinformation and how we're trying to think about this on Facebook, is that when we put deterrence in to try to make it harder for bad actors to do whatever they want to try to do, that means that we're also needing to put that friction on known actors as well. And we are requiring people who are perfectly good in their intent of what they're trying to do, but because we need to have deterrence in place to try to find the unknown actors, we've also got to apply this to known actors too. And that's been an interesting tension, just like with political advertising and that transparency. Because we are requiring people to give us an ID and prove they live in the United States, we're doing that for everyone.
Let me ask about this, because one of the most interesting policy changes at Facebook over the last year has been the public statements about the prioritization of privacy. And to me, that's great value. I value my privacy. I certainly, if anybody wants to send me Vladimir Putin's finances, please do it on Signal, which we'll delete after a day. But privacy is at tension with safety here and security, right? The best way, you found the fingerprints of the Russians because you had all of the data. And if Facebook has moved to a much more private system, you might not have had the data.
This is where we are now needing to also think about what are the deterrents that we can put in from a product perspective when thinking about behavior, not necessarily content. And so we've dealt a lot with this around WhatsApp and the elections in Brazil, Indonesia, and India, where that content's fully encrypted. We can't see what's being shared. It's just a phone number. And so one of the most powerful things that we did was limited the number of forwards that content could be forwarded down to 5. And so we're needing to think about those deterrents as well that we need to put into place to limit the spread of some of this information or the activity.
So Secretary Johnson, Ambassador, it's not just Facebook that is prioritizing privacy, it's the whole social media ecosystem. Does this worry you at all?
No, I view privacy as a security issue, as well as a privacy issue. It's the security of our data, it's the security of our lives. And so, in a very large respect, I'm pleased to see Facebook and the others moving in this direction.
No, I think, individual privacy is who we are. I mean, this is fundamental to the democracy here and the relationship between the government and the individual. And it's one of the pillars of our democracy. So sure, we have to pay attention to that.
All right, we all agree. Let's talk a little bit about what we're looking at, what we're seeing, and what we fear for 2020. We're going to talk about that for a couple minutes and then get your questions ready. So what is the most interesting threat? Or what is the threat that has not appeared yet, but that you worry about?
There's a lot of them. And the way we're thinking about this too is we brainstorm and do a lot of tabletop exercises to try to think of all of the things that we think could happen, but then we also want to make sure we're structured for the things that we aren't prepared for, because they're usually never very black and white. Deep fakes and manipulated video, something already happening, but very much on top of mind. We are starting to see, in Australia, there was misinformation being spread on Messenger around the Labour Party and whether or not they were going to introduce a death tax in that election. And if you think back to elections a decade ago and you had email forwards and you would have no idea where the origin of that email forward was or who had created the content in that, how do we think about that on vectors like WhatsApp and Messenger, and what can we do to better, again, taking some of those, the product changes like we did on WhatsApp for those. And then, a lot of conversation and thinking through both what foreign actors might be doing and paying attention to elections like those in the Ukraine to try to get a sense of anything new that they might be doing. How does this manifest itself in imagery? Is it false news? Is it still polarization? Is it something new? But also, how do we define this in a domestic sense? Like I mentioned earlier, is it different? Because if you look purely at behavior, what is legitimate online campaign organizing, when you look at the behavior of that, can very much mirror what you see from these coordinated inauthentic behavior campaigns. Yep. And what they're trying to do. And so how do we identify between those when we're looking just at behavior and not content?
Emerging threats. So I worry about the cybersecurity of individual campaigns. Mm-hmm. I believe that some campaigns are more sophisticated than others when it comes to their cybersecurity. I believe that in the rush of a campaign, people who work for campaigns are not always thinking about the cybersecurity of their data, of their communications. And campaigns are very much kind of on the fly. And so, infiltrating data of campaigns did not start in 2016. The weaponization of it in the US started in 2016, but infiltrating a campaign by a foreign actor is not new.
Okay. Let's move to audience questions. And I would like to say that one of the neatest threats I've seen is in the Ukraine and Russia, where apparently Russian operatives are calling Ukrainian politicians, pretending to be donors or ambassadors, recording snippets of their voice, and then using that to help make their deepfake videos. That is only to say, if you're a public official, when you ask your question, you may want to ask it in a squeaky voice because we are recording. Let's start right up here in the front.
All right. My name is Joyce, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and this is scary for me to ask because it seems like I must be way out of line here. But the question I have and the concerns I have are a little more insidious. It's more domestic than international, in the fact that and again it goes with surveillance capitalism, and with Facebook especially. Like, you gather so much information, millions and millions of information from individuals in this country, and the way that it has been used, again, I might be misinformed on this, but I'm of the impression that twice now, Facebook got in trouble for all of the information they used, and then they had done research on it with behavioral manipulation, bragged about it, and then realized, this must not be okay with the American public. And then in that, from what I understand, during the campaigns, you were definitely, Facebook was definitely bipartisan in this, in that they offered it both to Hillary and Trump, in the sense that Hillary, from what I understand, did not accept it, but Trump did accept the invite to take on many Facebook staff members to come in and work on his campaign, in that the campaigns used, with the amount of information that you had gathered, you were able to use that in ads to help in the most minutia of information gathered in that. And I understand ads. Yeah, I mean, we've been doing this forever.
Let's let Katie jump in here, because we're pretty short on time, and
Yeah,
that's
no,
two
I think
very
they're-
important
they're
questions.
very fair questions, and there's a lot of changes that we have made in both of these areas. On the privacy side, this is why we are continuing to move towards more of showing you, giving you the ability to see all of your data, the ability to clear the history of the data that you do have. As Mark mentioned the other day, I don't know if you were there or not, but because of the amount of it, one of our bigger struggles as well is making it easier and intuitive for consumers in which to do that with the data. In terms of help to campaigns, so we had people that were supporting the Trump campaign, the Hillary campaign, many campaigns up and down the ballot. The campaigns did choose to use the platforms differently. And there's many stories that have been written about that, many in Wired, of how the campaigns had done that. We have now, over the last 2 years though, we have shifted some of our work there so that we can better scale that out. We have a lot more of it available publicly. We are not having people as regularly go to the campaigns, but we are still providing customer support because they still want to know how can we run an ad? How do these new tools work that you may have? And we always continually look at what are additional things that we may need to do to continue to how do we need to continue to think about treating political and issue ads differently? We've done the transparency work. We've done more work so you know if it's a custom audience. So it's stuff that we continue to work on. But my final thing I'll just say, though, and this is another example of where there's a limit of what we as Facebook can do, is I do think that there needs to be more discussion around the data that campaigns have and political parties have. How do they share it? Where are they able to use it or not? Because it is not just at a place like Facebook that they're doing it. This type of micro-targeting was done before Facebook even existed in the 2002 campaign, where they were using that data to better understand, should I run an ad on the phishing network versus ABC, because it was going to be a lot cheaper for me to reach my core voters on the phishing network.
All right, great. And the gentleman in the blue shirt in the middle, please. We got a lot of hands, which is excellent. And thank you.
Thank you. I just want to confirm something I thought I heard the panel say. And if that's the case, fine, why? Are we saying that the United States has not carried out the same type of activity with respect to foreign nations, and that we are only considering using it if things go awry again in 2020? And I guess
Let's answer that.
It can't be right, but
So that's a good question.
no, that's not what I intended to say. You should assume that our government has all sorts of offensive cyber capabilities, and you should assume that covert action has been something that has been an arsenal in the U.S. weaponry for a very, very long time.
And if that's the case, which makes common sense to me, why haven't we, as a result of what we've been going through recently, done it to them, release Putin's financial information or whatever at an even higher level to make to try to explain to them, you do this
should
to
ask
us.
that of the current administration.
There is no administration.
We really don't. We're not in a position to know everything that the government has done over the last 2 years.
Thank you. In 2018, there were a couple of trials for mobile internet voting in West Virginia, in the primary, also in the general election.
Yep.
I think both seem to work just fine. Recently this year, Denver, locally here, had online mobile internet voting. My question is, with today's technologies, including cryptography, blockchain, things like that, where you can, as you said, track your vote all the way to being counted, do you think mobile voting can help us secure our voting security system?
Perhaps. I'm not an expert on voting technology. I do believe in redundancy. I do believe in audit trails, not necessarily paper. And I do believe in the ability of a citizen to track their vote from beginning to end. And I'm pleased that state election officials, and they still view this as their province, the way our democracy works, are focused on this. For a long time, we allowed ourselves to exist in a very arcane, primitive world when it came to how we count votes. And over the last 2 years, I think a lot of state election officials have woke up to the threat and are now addressing it, and the public they serve is demanding it.
Gentleman in green in the center.
Just going to draw on a little bit of Article 3 experience. I'm a judge in Los Angeles. You know, it strikes me that one of the important issues is not so much the integrity of our ballot process, which is critical, but the appearance of the integrity of that process. And what scares me is that we have an election that is counted correctly, the ballots are counted correctly, but there's enough gray area in terms of the argument that it wasn't done correctly, where the entire legitimacy of the process is called into question. You know, appearance is everything. So to me, not having paper ballots as a backup it just makes no sense. The other thing is, in terms of NATO, perhaps we need something like Article 5 applied to cyber attacks on the election process of our allies.
So if I may just come back on that, I very much share your concern that it may not be the actual changing of the vote that affords the greatest vulnerability here, but rather the perception that over time erodes the confidence of us, Americans, in the process itself, right? It's kind of more the psychology and the confidence in our system. And that's why I'm concerned about things like manipulation of the voter registration databases, which cause people to take the time out of the day to go to the polling place only to be turned away, right? That's a pretty emotional event, right? Or manipulation of the tallies on the back end, which could impart a lot of doubt. With regard to NATO and Article 5, and one just quick aside here. So this is the part of the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And before the 2016 experience, NATO leaders agreed that a cyber attack could rise to the level of Article 5 and trigger a response. So they've somewhat updated the 1949 treaty to account for cyber.
So the issue you raise is not one that began in 2016. I mean, how many of us in this room believe that the vote count for president in the year 2000 was spot on accurate? So the integrity of the way we count votes in this country has been a problem for a very long time, in large part because of the thousands of different ways in which we count votes across this country. The issue of whether a cyber attack should be considered an act of war warranting a military response is one I testified about last year in the House Armed Services Committee. And the basic conclusion of all the best legal scholars is, if a cyber attack has a kinetic effect, like the destruction of a building or the taking of human life, there can be a kinetic response in kind. My one addition to that is that, in my judgment, the United States should not reach for an overly aggressive definition of what constitutes an act of war, which could be used against us.
The gentleman on the far side, please, by the window. By the way, I think the vote count in 2000 was 5-4, properly counted.
I will remember that comment as the best comment this weekend. So Mark Zuckerberg said something that I thought was interesting that you guys were talking about here, which is that big is better. We should deal with one big company or 3 big companies rather than 50 small ones. But I think with big comes responsibility. And one of the things that he seemed to talk about was the idea that information should be as broadly shared as possible, rather than the other way around, which is to say, in order for you to speak, it's sort of like me getting on an airplane. I have to prove who I am and what I'm doing. If I'm going to go online to a bank, I have to prove who I am and what I'm doing. Is there another way to think about this, where these bad actors, in order to post something, you have to say who you are, prove, I'm not a robot, that stuff that we do, but prove who you are and what you're doing, label it and say, This is news. This is analysis. This is satire. This gets into the whole, sort of the fake video sort of thing. And rather than have Facebook have 30,000 people go through 1 billion things, instead on the front end, put some obligation on people, because I think the security and privacy thing is kind of backwards.
So you bring up a couple of points there. On that latter one that you mentioned, this has been a big struggle for us in the political ad space. Because I can ask you to tell me that information, but then we've got to validate it. And we've got to make sure that it's accurate. We ran into some of those issues with asking people to provide disclaimers for political ads for 2018. And we had it as a free-form one because, typically with campaign finance, folks knew what disclaimer they needed to do, and we wanted to provide those, the flexibility to qualify with the many different rules across the 9,000 jurisdictions that they have of how they have to disclose this work. And so that is the struggle we've had, because it's not enough to just ask them in which to do that. We've got to make sure, are they actually giving us accurate information? Because a bad guy is going to lie. They're not gonna give us the truth. To your first point, I think one thing as well of what Mark was talking about in terms of the antitrust stuff and all that, and I can only just speak to the election space, but by us having all the companies together, all of the 40 plus teams and the 500 full-time employees that we have working just on elections, plus the 30,000 safety and security folks, we are able to better have those lessons and those resources to be able to apply across all 4 of our platforms versus just one, because we've also seen with other platforms that aren't owned by us and don't have as many resources, they're not able to necessarily do as much.
All right, we have time for one more question. I believe the woman in the middle has had her hand up, but she does not. Her hand is down, so we'll go to the man in the front. We have 30 seconds.
Speed round.
No pressure.
Could you just quickly give us the state of being able to, how many polling places will have paper ballots or an equivalent way to audit the original ballot?
I don't know the number. There have been a number of studies about election cybersecurity now. There's a very good one in particular done by the Center for American Progress about a year ago that goes through state by state how they count votes, how they're doing in terms of their cybersecurity, and gives them a grade that outlines all of this. And it's a public thing. I'm sure it's online. Center for American Progress.
All right, that wraps it up. Please volunteer at your local polling place in the next election. Do not set up any botnets, and thank you very much for our fantastic panel. Thank you, sir.